In this unit, we're looking at 4.4. So far in Standard 4, we've looked at the Industrial Revolution. We've looked at how the Industrial Revolution got started, really because of the Transcontinental Railroad and how the railroad drove the Industrial Revolution and the economy. We've also looked at how that created a national market, which then hurt the Native Americans as well. And then we also looked at the different factors of production and how that aided the economic development during the Industrial Revolution. So what we've studied so far is that the government's really helped out businesses through tariffs and whatnot. And really, like, these entrepreneurs have come up and started creating monopolies. And so we've looked at it from a business perspective so far. Today we're going to look at it through a farmer and worker perspective, so an average everyday person's perspective. So we're going to look at that industrial growth in the business cycle and what that does to farmers and workers, immigrants and labor unions, and how that's going to lead to movements like the populist movement, and how those movements like the populist movement and the Grangers are both going to try to influence government to change conditions for the everyday person. And then we're going to talk about labor unions as well and how workers try to organize into those. So basically what's happening is big business is growing in the 19th century. It's not, remember I said in the last video that the success of big businesses wasn't shared by the workers. It's not shared by the farmers either. Both of them have pretty bad conditions, and so they start to organize politically and socially into groups to try to better their economic well-being. So what happens is, we're going to start with farmers, is they're going to overproduce. And you need to write that somewhere. They're going to overproduce. That's a really important phrase. What happened is that technology at the time led to more mechanization. That means more mechanical things on the farm, which is then going to lead to higher productivity. That higher productivity leads to a higher supply of product. Well, with supply and demand, the higher the supply, the lower the price. So supply actually exceeds demand. More people have the product than want to buy the product, if that makes sense. And so as a result, prices fall. So how farmers responded to that was by producing more, which actually created more of a problem. So they overproduced, and then as an individual level, farmers were like, well, if I need to make money, I'm going to have to produce more. But what happens is they end up producing too much, and they keep producing more and more and more, and the price just keeps going down and down and down. Instead of blaming themselves for the problem, which they really weren't to blame themselves, they blame the railroads. They say the railroads are charging them too much money to ship their goods, which is true. And so they try to organize against the railroads. And so they start participating in a movement called the Grange Movement, which originally was a social and educational organization, but does turn political. So this group of farmers, they start voting the same way, and they start voting people into office who agree with them. They have a lot of success at the state level. In the individual state legislatures, they do get some laws passed that regulate how much the railroads could charge. Because remember, they thought the railroads were charging them too much. So from the Grange do have a lot of success. The problem is that the Supreme Court actually says that some of those laws that the state legislatures pass are unconstitutional. And they say that the state legislatures actually can't regulate trade across state lines, which makes sense. For instance, in South Carolina, the state legislature can't regulate trade that goes between South Carolina and Georgia, or South Carolina and North Carolina. It's the national government's job to regulate trade across state lines. But that doesn't really help the farmers. So the United States Congress does get involved and does end up helping a little bit. They pass what's called the Interstate Commerce Act. And this is meant to regulate railroads. It's a big deal because it's the first time the government actually regulated a big business and showed that they were going to step in and try to help the common man versus the big business. Although the Supreme Court again is going to limit the effectiveness of the law. So farmers are still having very little success. So they're going to form into a group called the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party. This is formed to influence national government. They want to do a few different things, and you should know what these things are. First, they want to regulate the railroads and banks. They think that railroads and banks are cheating them out of a lot of money, charging them too much money, charging too high of interest rate in the bank's case. They also want to introduce free and unlimited silver as coinage because they want to cause inflation. So if they introduce money into the supply, create more money supply, then that's going to lead to higher prices. Those higher prices would then allow them to pay off their loans more easily. And I'll go through that specifically in class because I know it's kind of a confusing thing. They also want to change politics a little bit, make it a little bit fairer. They want a direct election of senators, meaning the people directly elect the senators as opposed to the state legislatures picking the senators. That doesn't actually get passed then, but it is passed a little bit later. They also want the secret ballot. Back before this time, there was no such thing as a secret ballot. When you went to vote, you weren't doing it in private. Anyone could see who you were voting for, and so it's not really a fair election. Fair elections can only take place when there's a secret ballot. They don't initially do it then either, but later they are going to adopt the secret ballot. And they also want a graduated income tax. That means the more you make, the more you pay. And that, again, doesn't happen during the populist era, but it does happen later. We have it today. And they also try to ally with workers. They want to push for an 8-hour workday to try to help workers out and try to make this a more national movement. They do have some success. They elect a few populist governors, they elect some populist senators and some state legislatures in the South and West, but they never win the presidency. The populist movement is much more successful in the South and the West. It's not very popular in the East because there's not a lot of farmers in the East. And one of the problems with the populist movement is a racial problem, in that in the South, the two, even though poor white farmers and poor black farmers should get along politically, they don't because of the racist elements that go along with that. So they don't have as much success as they could have in the South. So let's shift to talking about workers now. This is another group that's really disadvantaged. The conditions in the factories were bad. They had long hours, low wages, bad conditions. They generally worked 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day or more. There were so many workers that business owners don't really have to pay them a lot. If the worker didn't like getting paid a little bit, getting paid low wages, then the business owner would say like, oh well, go find another job, and they'd hire somebody else. There are a lot of immigrants looking for jobs, along with farmers who left the farms and came to the cities to find jobs. And this drives down pay. Same idea of supply and demand. There's a lot of workers, not a lot of jobs, so the pay is going to be pretty low. Management really treats workers as they're replaceable, which they are. And so they don't really try to fix conditions. They don't really try to negotiate with with workers because they don't really need to. As a result, workers start getting frustrated with their conditions and they start joining labor unions to protect themselves. These are groups of workers that join together. That's what a union is, a group of workers join together. And so they try to arbitrate. That means they try to negotiate with the business owners. They don't really want to go on strike because if they go on strike, they're not going to get paid. And of course, they need to be paid in order to survive. They don't really like the strike as a tool, but they will use it sometimes. Management's pretty tricky. Management knows that the government's going to support them and to help them out. So they're gonna do some things that are pretty bad to stop labor unions. They're going to use the Pinkertons to forcibly stop strikes through violence. They're also going to use the government to help out. They're also going to use African Americans and recent immigrants as scabs to break strikes. That means what a scab is when the worker goes on strike, this is the person that's used to fill that spot. So they really do everything they can to stop labor unions from being effective, and they're very successful at that. The government always supports management over workers, and they use the army to break up the strikes. Remember, the Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to be used to break up monopolies, but it's actually used in this time period to break up unions, even though it shouldn't. It doesn't make any sense that it does because unions are not trusts, they're not monopolies. The real reason why labor unions are ineffective, first off, the government not supporting unions, supporting the business owners, and sending the army in to break it up. The second reason is that the public perception of labor unions is so low. People think of unions as being socialist and anarchist and violent and radical, and in some cases that is true. They were those types of people, but in most cases they just want better wages. And so that the people don't really support, the public perception of labor unions is so low and the people don't support them. And so politically it's a bad idea. Politicians don't really join in to help labor unions. Skilled workers do have some success in labor unions because they're harder to replace. You can't just replace a skilled worker with anyone off the street. Unskilled workers, however, have very little success because it's so easy to replace them. Overall, unions had very little success. They're generally viewed as being radical and bad, and the government didn't really help the workers. This all kind of boils over in the election of 1896. It's basically what's called soft money versus hard money. Soft money would be money that's not backed by gold, and hard money would be money that is backed by gold. So it's basically inflationism versus hard money. And so you had William Jennings Bryan, who was the populist and the Democrat, run against William McKinley, who was for big businesses, and he was a Republican. McKinley ends up winning. So it's kind of a strike against workers, and a strike that's kind of like a bad thing against workers and farmers, while the business owners are protected again. One of the key parts of this, though, McKinley wins, but Theodore Roosevelt becomes his vice president, which is going to be important because McKinley is going to be assassinated, which is then going to allow Theodore Roosevelt to become president. And Theodore Roosevelt is a progressive who wants to help workers, and he will make a lot of changes. So he'll be closer to like what the populists believe. So I just want to hit some of those big ideas again because they're so important. So really just a quick: farmers overproduced. The farmers organized into populists. They wanted to have the coinage of silver so they could pay off their loans more easily. They also wanted to change government by the direct election of senators, the secret ballot, and the graduated income tax, none of which happened at that time, but will happen later. Talking about workers, there's a surplus of workers that led to low wages and bad conditions. Workers organized into labor unions, but those unions were really not that effective because the government didn't help them and because the unions were perceived as being radical and violent. And so there's not a lot of success for workers and farmers at this time. But there's hope because the progressive movement is coming, and that is going to really help change things for workers and farmers and really try to make big strides to help those disadvantaged groups. Thank you very much for watching. Please turn in your notes guide and make sure you write your name in ink on it. Thank you very much.